I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Joseph and Hiram Smith they're in Carthage Jail. They're not going to go anywhere, and they're not going to leave there alive anyway. So, we spent last week catching up with Emma and, kind of seeing her role in the preceding events, which landed her husband and brother-in-law in jail. So I want to spend a bit of time with some other inferior folks of the timeline to see what they've been up to lately as these tensions brewed between the Nauvoo Mormons and the Carthage anti-Mormons. Now, when I say inferior on these figures, I just mean that they're perceived as, less influential, or they're less crucial to the timeline, and therefore they have far less information written about them. So this episode will kind of be all over the place, but kind of hang in there with me because there are quite a few threads in the historical timeline to kind of tie together into June of 1844. So I want to start with one of my personal favorites in Nauvoo history for, let's say, complicated reason. Eliza R. Snow. She's kind of my personal crush. I'm not going to get into it, but Eliza Snow had a pretty busy 1843 and 44. So Emma and Eliza had some form of altercation. We talked about this on the episode titled Emma's Stairway to Hell. Accounts differ, but historians generally agree that some altercation did occur between Emma and Eliza. Immediately after that interaction, whatever it was, Eliza moved out of the Nauvoo homestead where she was living with her husband and sister wives. Now, where she moved to was the Morley settlement in Illinois known as Yellrum. Get it? Morley? Yellrum? Because Mormons are super basic with their code names. So Yellrum was run as a communalistic settlement by Father Isaac Morley, one of the earliest converts to the church who converted in 1830, who lived near Kirtland, Ohio. The Morley settlements in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois were always kind of a place of refuge for struggling and destitute Mormons who didn't have somewhere else to call home. Even the Smith family, including Joe and Emma, lived on the Morley settlement in Ohio when they first got there in early 1831, as the church was becoming the headquartered in Kirtland, Ohio. So Eliza had moved into the Nauvoo homestead with the Smiths, and she considered that home. But with the conflict between her and Emma, no place where they shared the same roof would be a peaceful home. So moving to the Morley settlement named Yellrum, probably in mid-1843, was Eliza's best option to keep the peace between sister wives. Well, Eliza Snow lived out the remainder of 1843 through to April 1844 on the Morley settlement. Now, Yellrum wasn't spectacular living conditions, but it had roofs and beds to lay one's head at night. Typically, the folks who lived on the Morley settlement were people who were down and out, or families whose, father and husband was on a mission, or some of them were even sealed to Isaac as his wives and his celestial family. Eliza fell into that category after she was violently removed from the Smith homestead. She didn't have many options available to her, and settling into one of those communal cabins in Yellrum seemed to be her best option. She was down and out. Yellrum, however, was about 30 miles south of Nauvoo, with Warsaw and Carthage between the two cities. So Eliza's calling as secretary of the Relief Society went on hold when she moved to Yellrum. When that happened, a woman named Phoebe Emma Wheeler took over the scribal duties of Eliza. Emma also didn't attend another Relief Society meeting for the rest of the year after Eliza was kicked out of Emma's house. Every absence is noted by both Emma and her counselors from July to October of 1843 before the Relief Society went on hiatus for the winter until March of 1844 before they met again. Many times, the Relief Society Minute Book notes that Emma was sick and requests the Relief Society to pray for her, but other passages in the Relief Society Minute Notes just say that she wasn't there for unknown reasons. But it wasn't just Emma who was gone from the Relief Society meetings for the latter half of 1843. Eliza Snow was absent as well. Phoebe Wheeler took the Relief Society notes for the rest of the year with a very brief meeting in September when an unidentified scribe took the Relief Society minutes for the morning meeting in black ink instead of blue ink that fills the other pages of the meeting minute book. Now, Eliza can be tracked through her journal and poems in Nauvoo. Eliza was, quote-unquote, politely presented an empty notebook by a friend of hers by the name of Sarah Melissa Kimball sometime in March of 1842. So in the 1840s and not let alone the 19th century, paper, and especially an entire empty notebook, was a gracious and costly gift for this Sarah Kimball to give to Eliza when it was being used for unofficial purposes. Well, Whiteout Willard Richards had provided Eliza with an empty notebook for the Relief Society minutes. So the small gift notebook from Sarah Kimball, according to Maureen Erstenbach Beecher, Eliza's biographer, quote, "So this notebook lay unused for 3 months," end quote. The first entry is marked for 29th June 1842, the day Eliza married Joseph, which can only be inferred by decoding her coded language, that same coded language that clouds the history of polygamy. We talked about it a lot last week. So Maureen Beecher, the modern historian, the biographer of Eliza R. Snow, Maureen Beecher expresses the struggle for historians in decoding this language as representative of the struggle of Eliza to properly record her thoughts on that momentous day of her marriage. Now, of course, you're going to find a link to Beecher's edited version of Eliza's Nauvoo journal in the show notes for this week's episode. From Maureen Beecher, quote, "The first entry in the new book is dated 29th June 1842, written in a manner far removed from the concise, direct style of Eliza's usual prose. It seems to be struggling to express feelings without disclosing the events which precipitated those feelings. This is a day of much interest to my feelings," Eliza begins, and wanders off into vague references to her family and their plans for moving, end quote. When we understand the context of Eliza's recent life-changing event, when that first entry was recorded, it seems as if she was what we'd call today both body and sex positive. And in order to illustrate my point, let me read that first entry from June 29th, 1842, and just try to listen to this entry with the understanding that Nauvoo Mormonism was in the process of evolving into a free love community, and Eliza had just been inducted into that inner community within a community. She also provides a few signals that her worldview was perceived through the, let's just say, the more esoteric arts. Quote, "This is a day of much interest to my feelings. Reflecting on past occurrences, a variety of thoughts have presented themselves to my mind with regards to events which have chased each other in rapid succession in the scenery of human life. As an individual, I have not passed altogether unnoticed by change," she capitalized to change there, "in reference to present circumstances and future prospects. 2 weeks and 2 days have passed since an intimation was presented of my duty and privilege of remaining in the city of the saints in case of the removal of my father's family. 1 week and 2 days have transpired since the family left, and though I rejoice in the blessing of the society of the saints and the approbation of God, a lonely feeling will steal over me before I am aware, while I am contemplating the present state of society, the powers of darkness and the prejudices of the human mind which stand arrayed like an impregnable barrier against the work of God." The work of God. This is all coded language, right? She was just revealed to the doctrine of polygamy when she wrote this, right? "While these thoughts were revolving in my mind, the heavens became shadowed with clouds, and a heavy shower of rain and hail ensued, and I exclaimed, 'Oh God, is it not enough that we have the prepossessions of mankind, their prejudices, and their hatred to contend with, but must we also stand amid the rage of elements?' I concluded within myself that the period might not be far distant that will require faith to do so, but the grace of God is sufficient, therefore I will not fear. I will put my trust in Him who is mighty to save, rejoicing in His goodness and determined to live by every word that proceedeth out of His mouth." End quote. When she's referring to God, she capitalizes Him. When she's referring, but the second, or the last His mouth there, that's not a capitalized H. That is Joseph. So another entry from August of 1842, just a few months after this first entry, it reveals some conflict within the new and everlasting covenant that Eliza had recently been inducted into. Eliza tells us that Emma called on her to move into the Nauvoo homestead, which provided some conflict between her and her sister wife, Sarah Cleveland, Emma and Eliza's newest sister wife and a counselor in the Relief Society. Quote, Mrs. Sarah Cleveland, having come to the determination of moving on to her lot, my former expectations were frustrated, but the Lord has opened the path to my feet, and I feel disposed to acknowledge his hand in all things. This sudden, unexpected change in my location I trust is for good. It seemed to come in answer to my petitions to God to direct me in the path of duty according to his will. End quote. And after this entry is when Eliza moved into the homestead, the Smith homestead, with her sister wives. While there, she taught school and she helped Emma and others in the Relief Society presidency and with plenty of other sundry affairs. And she also continued to wax poetic whenever occasion or circumstances demanded it. Her journal does include poem after poem interspersed among her various actual journal entries. And we've read a few of her poems on the show before when they, capture a certain emotion of specific subject matter. Her poems convey feelings that aren't present in any other journal entry of the time. And she also composed poems as basically commissions for friends who lost a family member or a child. One of these was written for an elder Lorenzo Barnes, who died on a mission in Bradford, England in December of 1842. Eliza also recounts the return of her older brother, Lorenzo Snow, when he arrived in Nauvoo from his mission with the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in England. Quote, Wednesday, the 12th April, 1843. This day I have the inexpressible happiness of once again embracing a brother who had been absent nearly 3 years. I cannot describe the feelings which filled my bosom when I saw the steamboat Amaranth moving majestically up the Mississippi and thought perhaps Lorenzo was on board. My heart overflowed with gratitude when, after the landing of the boat, I heard President Hiram Smith say to me, "Your brother has actually arrived." It is a time of mutual rejoicing which I shall never forget. End quote. And Eliza didn't feel up to the task of telling her older brother, Lorenzo, that she had found a nice man her age to marry. And instead, Eliza told her husband to teach Lorenzo about the new and everlasting covenant and explained that she was now married. Now, Lorenzo wouldn't take his own polygamous wives until October of 1844, and that was 4 months after Joe and Hiram died in Carthage. Notably as well, 6 of Lorenzo Snow's 9 wives by the time of his death in 1901 were teenagers when he married them. Now, Lorenzo was apparently opposed to celestial marriage initially, but he clearly got over it pretty quickly once he aligned with the Brighamite faction coming out of the schism crisis and headed out to Mexico. Eliza continues entries throughout her journal for 1843. So she spent some months writing nearly daily, while other entries span weeks or months after the previous entry. She notes every major event that we've discussed on the show: the mysterious death of Judge Elias Higbee, the arrest and ensuing legal battle of Joseph Smith in Dixon, Illinois by Sheriffs Wilson and Reynolds, bickering and drama from polygamy, her removal to Yell Room and all of those ensuing feelings, the perceived persecution of the Mormons and Joseph Smith from the legal system, the trial of Hingepin Sidney Rigdon when Joe tried to excommunicate Rigdon and the High Council refused, Eliza's dream that, quote, "My father spoke to me of prospects 19 months to come," end quote. And even Eliza's October 1843 poem to Eliza Partridge, telling her to not be so depressed about the situation she found herself in. Eliza Snow's journal truly is a remarkable artifact of Nauvoo, and her writing style provides only a brief window into the secretive nature of the criminal empire of Nauvoo. Notably as well, while Eliza Snow lived on the Morley settlement, Yell Room, on December 19th, 1843, she received her patriarchal blessing from Isaac Morley. In it, Isaac promises Eliza that, quote, "Thy name shall be handed down to posterity from generation to generation, and many songs shall be heard that were dictated by thy pen, and from the principles of thy mind, even until the choirs from on high and the earth below shall join in one universal song of praise to God and the Lamb." End quote. Eliza doesn't record any of her own thoughts or feelings about her patriarchal blessing, but she is kind enough to reprint the blessing in its entirety in her journal. It's really a wonderful artifact. Eliza Snow's 1844 entries are unfortunately very light. She had one entry for January 1844, two for February, and one for April, marking her last journal entry during her husband's life. Now, the entry from January and the first entry from February are just poems that she wrote for friends who had recently lost their children. The first one was, quote, to Mrs. Mary Ann Pratt on the death of her little son, end quote, while the second poem is to, quote, Mrs. Lyons, end quote, whose daughter had also died in Yelrum. In reading through her journal, Eliza R. Snow strikes me as such an optimist. Page after page talks about her good feelings and the grand designs of Zion and the Lord's plans. Her penultimate entry in the 1844 year comes from February 20th, which talks about her attending a prayer meeting in Lima, the next village north of Yelrum, which was where she was living. Now, I've long speculated that psychedelics were involved in these prayer meetings, particularly on those prayer meetings on the Morley settlements in both Ohio and Illinois. And anybody with personal experience with psychedelics will see why I see Eliza R. Snow as kind of a proto-free love psychonaut hippie when we see stuff like this. Quote, spent last evening, much to my satisfaction, entertainment, and instruction, at a blessing meeting, blessing is capitalized, at Brother Beebe's in Lima. It was quite a treat to my mind, one of the bright spots on the page of my life, never to be forgotten, end quote. Now, Todd Compton's In Sacred Loneliness details numerous of these prayer and blessing meetings that Eliza Snow either attended or called together among her friends. Quote, on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1843, Eliza wrote, a social circle of a few choice friends convened at the house of our sister, and we had a lovely time. A meeting that probably included tongues and prophecy, end quote. Another passage from Eliza's journal in October 1843 reads, quote, some circumstances of very peculiar interest occurred during my visit to the city. Everything connected with our affections is engraven on the heart and needs not the perpetuating touch of the sculptor, end quote. These prayer meetings, which fill her Nauvoo journal, they weren't just held in Kirtland and Nauvoo, but all across the plains and into Utah. Eliza's path can be traced by these prayer meetings with her friends, who were largely the sisters in the Relief Society presidency in Nauvoo and Utah. Eliza's role as Relief Society secretary would never be filled by her again after her ouster from Nauvoo and relocation to Yelrum in mid-1843. The women who took over the role of secretary for the Relief Society were Phoebe M. Wheeler, an unidentified scribe for a single meeting, and then Hannah Ells, who was the scribe for the very final meeting of the Relief Society in Nauvoo before the Schism crisis began. For this period, from mid-1843 to mid-1844, Eliza Snow becomes a bit of a mysterious figure. She did, however, continue to write poems when daily entries in her journal, are just absent. They're just not there, or they wouldn't do proper justice to what was going on. Many of these poems were initially written in her journal or transcribed from being written somewhere else into her journal. Many of them were printed in The Wasp or the Nauvoo Neighbor. Others weren't published until the Utah era, during the Mormon Reformation era, when she was in the process of organizing the Relief Society there. The final poem that Eliza wrote before the assassinations of her husband and Hiram was just a few short lines to Lauren Miranda and Emily Matilda Hyde. Here we go. Quote, fair little misses, always do, as your fond mother teaches you. And you shall both your brother meet, and fill his cheeks with kisses sweet. Be to each other very kind, with useful studies store your mind. To God our Father bow the knee, and when you pray, remember me. Composed June 2nd, 1844. The rest of Eliza's poems reveal her personal struggles, as well as her struggles, the struggles of all of the saints, really, with the deaths of Joe and Hiram, and we're going to save those for a later time. So let's go ahead and catch up with the Quorum of Apostles. It's been a while since we talked about them. Back in the March 21st, 1844 meeting of the Council of 50, Joe's theocratic cabinet, basically, Joe and the leadership were developing his presidential campaign. Now, folks needed to be dispatched across America to spread the good word of how great a candidate Joseph Smith was. Accordingly, from the Council of 50 Minutes, quote, President J. Smith recommended that the 12 should select men from the quorums of the 70s and high priests and send them to preach and electioneer through the different states, and then as many of the 12 as can follow these elders and hold conferences in the various branches of the church through the states, end quote. The role of the Quorum of Apostles in Joe's church is largely different than the apostles today. Now, today's apostles in the Salt Lake City church are tasked with running the church and sitting on boards and directing the actions of the quorums of the 70s, the middle managers, and various other administrative duties. However, in Joe's church, they were mostly permanent missionaries. They carried with them the weight of the presidency of the church in that they could baptize people, they could organize branches, wards, and stakes, they could ordain local leaders to organize congregations, and they'd preside over meetings wherever they went. The role of the apostles developed out of necessity in Utah to become the administrative body that it is today. During the earliest meetings of the Council of 50, starting in March of 1844, they were drafting their own constitution. Double Dub Phelps was writing Joe's campaign platform, for President of the United States. And the members of the Council of 50 were constantly deliberating on who the vice presidential nominee should be until they finally settled on Hingepin Sidney Rigdon. Now, Rigdon was super interested in building the Mormon theocracy, as was everybody who was involved in the Council of 50. As much as Rigdon's public presence in the church has been minimized in the historical record, Rigdon was an acting and very active member of the Council of 50. In the March 21st meeting, he, quote, made some lengthy and animated remarks on various subjects, particularly on the situation of Texas and her position in regard to other nations, end quote. During the next meeting on March 26th, quote, he entered into the subject of the kingdom of God in a most spirited and animated manner, showing the glory and joy which will exist when God reigns over the nation, when oppression shall cease, and the righteous enjoy the blessings of the kingdom, end quote. In the April 4th, 1844 meeting, Rigdon, quote, referred largely to the anticipations of the ancients respecting the glories of the days in which we live, showing that the angels had joy in heaven when before the creation they looked down and saw the privileges we enjoy in this organization, end quote. Rigdon went on to further articulate the importance of the Native Americans in the Mormon theocracy building campaign when he, quote, was speaking of 11 of the Potawatomi tribe of Indians, attended by a French interpreter, appeared and were admitted into the council. They made known that they were friendly to the Mormon people and wanted their influence. They had been oppressed by the U.S. government and did not want to sell them any more land, end quote. So Rigdon brought this fire and fury of the Mormon theocracy into the public preaching when he gave a sermon for the church on April 6, 1844, during the last general conference under Joseph Smith, when Joe gave his famed King Follett discourse. During this speech, Rigdon stated, quote, when God sets up a system of salvation, he sets up a system of government. When I speak of government, I mean what I say. I mean a government that shall rule over temporal and spiritual affairs, end quote. Now, Bloody Brigham, in the same general conference, echoed these sentiments only 3 days later in his speech when he said, quote, that there was no dividing line between the government of God and the government of the children of men, that the government belongs to God, end quote. These were common sentiments of those who were in the Council of 50. It was to be the theocratic kingdom of the world, the last government the world would ever need. The Council and the Quorum of Apostles, they shifted their efforts to being an effective campaign team for Joseph Smith, but all of this theocracy building in Zion was in the back of their minds with everything. It was what motivated all of their actions. The presidency of the United States and Joe getting elected to it, that was only the beginning, and it was a good place to start. Now, the Joseph Smith Papers has an editorial note on their transcription of the Council of 50 Minutes, and it says, quote, By mid-April, nearly 350 men, including many members of the Council of 50, had been given assignments to campaign across the United States, end quote. 350 men who were out on the mission solely of electioneering for Joseph Smith. This same meeting of the Council of 50 that is preceded by this editorial note happening on April 25th, 1844, is when the council voted and received by unanimous consent the new constitution of the Mormon theocracy. And the next meeting on May 3rd, Joe took the stand. Quote, Joseph Smith wanted Elder Lyman White and every other man who could leave to go into all the states and preach and electioneer for him to be president. And when he is president, we can send out ministers, a plenipotentiary, I don't know what that word is, plenipotentiary, who will secure to themselves such influence that when their office shall cease, they may be received into everlasting habitations. But we should never indulge our appetites to injure our influence or wound the feelings of friends or cause the Spirit of the Lord to leave us. Joe concluded, the remarks that it is best to run on a long race and be careful to keep good wind, etc. End quote. So the men took Joe's suggestion seriously, and after that following meeting just 3 days later, many concluded to take their various directions across the nation to electioneer for Joe and to meet with other powerful men and tell them how good of a candidate Joe was. This was also during, this was going on in May 6th meeting, and that May 6th meeting is when the council devised a plan for settlement of various members of the council and the Quorum of Apostles. Lucian Woodworth, George Miller, and Lyman White were tasked with meeting the Texas President Sam Houston. Hingepin Sidney Rigdon, quote, consented to run for the vice presidency if the council wished, end quote, and was sent to his old stomping grounds in Pennsylvania to electioneer and get votes for Joe as president from that state. Almond Babbitt, another counselor, was appointed to go on a mission to either France or Russia, quote, or some other popular kingdom, end quote. All of these moves were exciting for the Council of 50, and these men were all really ambitious about making this happen. From the Council of 50, quote, Elder Lyman White reminded Elder Rigdon of a certain prophecy that the Lord promised to vex the nations, and the nation could not be vexed worse than for Joseph to be president and Brother Rigdon vice president, end quote. The nation could not be more vexed than to elect Joseph Smith to be president. I would love to have a balance scale and put 20/20 on the other side of it, but I'm not sure if that was actually an endorsement or it was more of like a warning or a harbinger of how bad Rigdon and Joe would be at their jobs, because it could kind of go either way with Lyman White saying that. But regardless, quote, Elder Rigdon referred to a former prophecy and said, I am satisfied God intends to do just what we are doing, end quote, which was followed with, quote, the chairman Joseph Smith confirmed it, end quote. So Rigdon had conditions to running as vice president for Joseph Smith. Quote, Elder Rigdon asked the privilege, after Joseph had been president 4 years, that he should be president the next term, which was granted. And he stated that that as the Lord lives, Joseph shall be president next term, and I will follow, end quote. This clearly reveals that once Joe was elected president of the United States, the Council of 50 never intended to have another presidential election. So these men were sent in all various directions to electioneer, some of them carrying the Mormon memorial to Congress in Washington, D.C., which declared Nauvoo as a sovereign territory, and it petitioned Congress for 100,000 volunteers to go liberate the Oregon Territory. It is notable that after all of these meetings were happening, and right before like the 2 or 3 final meetings, Joseph Smith put the Council of 50 essentially on hiatus because he was afraid that they were going to raise too much of a suspicion from the outside world with them constantly meeting and taking all the notes and talking about the Mormon theocracy being built. They only met, I believe it was 3 times after Joseph Smith put them on brief hiatus to try and keep things under wraps as much as possible. But then everything happened after it, of course, kind of put everything with the Council of 50 on hold. Well, because their presidential candidate kind of was dead, right? But with all of these political maneuvers going on, contemporary events definitely weighed on their decisions. The dissenting group of the church formed their own religion inside Nauvoo, and they just shipped their own printing press into the city. These dissenters were the Higbees, the Fosters, and the Laws, who named William Law as the president of the true Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they printed the Nauvoo Expositor with that shiny new press. Rigdon, Hiram Smith, Lucian Woodworth, Uncle John Smith, and some of the other Council of 50 members all personally confronted the Laws, the Fosters, and the Higbees about their new church and what they planned on doing with that new shiny printing press. William Law responded to Rigdon that, quote, he would set up a press and go it to the death to get satisfaction, end quote. Which wasn't an idle realization, because William Law and all of the printers of the Nauvoo Expositor lived with the constant threat of a visit from the Danites late at night. Pistol packing Porter Rockwell knocking on your window. Bloody Brigham Young recounts this time in his manuscript history of this whole time period we're discussing here. And he notes the General Conference in April 1844, where Joe gave his King Fly discourse, and the Rigdon said that they were setting up the last government that the world would ever need. In his history, Brigham says, quote, the prophet declared that all North and South America was the land of Zion. At the close of the conference, 344 elders volunteered to go on missions, end quote. Brigham himself was joined on a brief expedition to the Morley settlement, where Eliza Snow was living, near Lima, by Wilford Woodruff, and they both preached, and they got another 26 volunteers for this Mormon propaganda / electioneering campaign. Brigham also talks about the lawsuit against Francis M. Higbee by Joseph Smith, where Brigham was called in to testify right before he and the rest of the Quorum of Apostles and members of the Council of 50 all left Nauvoo for their various missions, with all those 350 plus volunteers. So Bloody Brigham finally departed Nauvoo on May 21st, 1844, and he details his journey through St. Louis, where he preached to, quote, about 700 members, end quote. But here I thought it was illegal to be a Mormon in Missouri since the Mormon extermination order, but here Brigham Young is preaching in St. Louis on May 21st, 1844. Quite remarkable. Anyway, Brigham also preached on board the steamer that they took from St. Louis to Cincinnati to, quote, allay some prejudice which had been manifested against the elders on board, end quote. And Brigham wasn't alone during these parts of the journey. He lists Lyman White, Heber the Creeper Kimball, Franklin D. Richards, Lester Brooks. I've never seen that guy's name before, but he's one of these inferior figures, and a few other guys who were all traveling along with him. So they went through Pittsburgh and they attended various meetings before they passed through Old Britain, Warren, and Akron on their way to Kirtland, Ohio, the old headquarters of the church. When they passed through Akron, they attended an abolition convention. Brigham Young attended an abolitionist convention in 1844, and he describes the folks there, quote, some of whom manifested a spirit to put down everybody but themselves, end quote. Yeah, when those folks did, kind of win the war, they kind of got their way. They put down all of the slaveholders except for themselves. So, hooray for the abolitionists being on the right side of history, even if Brigham Young himself wasn't at the time. Now, once he was in Kirtland with a couple of his friends, Bloody Brigham Young found his brother John Young and his sister Nancy Kent. And the very next day after his arrival, he preached in the Kirtland Temple. Brigham Young preached in the Kirtland Temple in late May 1844. And the Kirtland Temple at this time was in the possession of a break-off faction of the church. Martin Harris was living in Kirtland. Quote, I lectured in the evening on the subject of the location of Nauvoo. The saints were dead and cold to the things of God, end quote. Oh, how those Kirtland saints, oh, how the salt has lost its savor. Am I right, Bloody Brigham Young? He also preached in, quote, Hiram, Ohio, and held a meeting in sight of the house where Joseph and Sidney were dragged out by the heels and tarred and feathered, end quote. We discussed that story 5 years ago on the podcast, and Brigham Young here, just 3 weeks before, 4 weeks, I guess it is, before Joseph and Hiram were dead, he's preaching back in the old stomping grounds of the headquarters of the church in the Kirtland Temple in Hiram, Ohio, where Joe and Sidney were beaten and tarred and feathered, and Joe was almost castrated. memories. It feels good. It feels good. I'm just, getting a little wistful, a little reminiscent here. I can't help it. Anyway, from there, Brigham Young and Franklin Richards proceeded to Chester, where they visited Brigham's sister, and then they spent a night at Brother Butler's, and I assume that's John L. Butler, but I can't seem to verify who that actually was. And from thence, Brigham and company went to Fairport and took a steamer to Buffalo, quote, where we arrived on the morning of June 13th, and went by rail cars to Albany, and from thence by steamboat to New York, and proceeded to Boston, where I arrived on the morning of Sunday, the 16th of June, end quote. Now, during that little tiny window of traveling from Kirtland to Boston over exactly 7 days, the Nauvoo Expositor had been published. The city council had met and resolved to destroy the press, and it had been burned. Justice Morrison had sworn out an arrest warrant against Joe and 17 other men in Carthage for, to be heard in Carthage. They held their first sham trial in the Nauvoo Municipal Court in response to Judge Morrison's arrest warrant. They received word from Judge Thomas that first hearing, that first sham trial wasn't good enough, so they held the second hearing in front of Daniel H. Wells. The Warsaw Signal had called for a war of extermination. The gathering militia forces in Carthage were somewhere around 500 men, and the governor of Illinois was en route to Carthage to handle matters personally. In that week time that it took Brigham to get from Kirtland to Boston, that's everything that happened. It is insane how fast things were happening, and all of it without his or anybody's knowledge. And any of the elders, any of the Quorum of the Apostles, any of the Council of 50 members, they were all scattered throughout the nation. None of them knew what was going on in Nauvoo at this time, but all of those events are contemporary with what I just described with Brigham Young's little trip. And over the next few days, Brigham dallied about Lowell and Salem and Boston and a bunch of local smaller cities without the slightest inkling that Nauvoo and Carthage were on the precipice of literal war. It wasn't just Brigham out and about, because George A. Smith was in Petersboro, New Hampshire. Johnny Page was in Pittsburgh. Heber the Creeper Kimball was in Washington, D.C. with Orson Pratt. Wilford Woodruff was in Portage, New York. Crazy Willie Smith, Joe's youngest surviving brother, was in Philadelphia with Orson Hyde. George Miller was in Richmond, Kentucky. P.Q. Parley P. Pratt was in New York City. And Amasa Lyman was in Cincinnati. All of these men were members of the Council of 50 and the Quorum of Apostles, and they were out electioneering for Joe's presidential campaign, while Nauvoo was gearing up for the next Mormon war, and Joe was in hiding from arrest and extradition to Carthage. Now, Brigham wouldn't hear rumors of Joe and Hiram's death until July 9th, more than a week and a half after it happened, and he wouldn't receive confirmation that they had died until July 16th, when he, quote, brought his hand down on my knee, and he infamously declared, "The keys of the kingdom are right here with the church," end quote. And he began his vicious power grab game. Lucy Mack Smith has been a figure lurking largely in the shadows of our historical timeline since the death of her husband, Big Daddy Cheese, Joe Smith Sr., in September of 1840. Lucy Mack has only come up twice since then that I can recall in our timeline. The first was when we were talking about the Book of Abraham, and Lucy told some Quaker reporters in the late 1840s that Joe translated the Egyptian papyri using Precious and Mr. Hat, the little seer stone and the stovepipe hat trick. The last time that Lucy Mack Smith came up was when Jane Manning James moved into the Nauvoo mansion where Lucy had her own room. Jane came into the room where Lucy was sitting in her chair, and Lucy told Jane to go to the cabinet and open the drawer, and that's where Jane first saw the Egyptian papyri and the seer stone that Joe used to translate it, well, to author the Book of Abraham. Now, I've mentioned Lucy a few other times, but she's largely remained in the backstage of our timeline in Nauvoo, and the primary reason for that is she just didn't do much other than paint rugs and sew for income when she was feeling up to it. Lucy has been ill for most of the timeline that we've been discussing in Nauvoo, but she did attend various Relief Society meetings, though, so that is pretty notable. She spoke at the April 19th, 1842 meeting, And this is just 18 months after her husband of 44 years had died. And it is equally tragic and revealing of her situation. Quote, Mother Smith spoke very pathetically of her lonely situation and the feelings she had as she reflected on the care which Father Smith always felt for the sisters when in life he presided over the meetings. End quote. Lucy was, however, even in her sickness and mourning, a strong exhorter of the faith. During the March 31st, 1842 Relief Society meeting, she spoke at length. Quote, Mother Smith rose, now March 31st, 1842 Relief Society meeting. I think this is the fourth meeting of the Relief Society ever, because it was organized in early March 1842. So this is the March 31st meeting. Quote, Mother Smith rose and said she was glad the time had come that iniquity could be detected and reproach thrown off from the heads of the church. Oh, all those polygamy rumors. Oh, we must, iniquity can be detected now. We have to throw off reproach from the heads of the church. There's no way that my sons are guilty of polygamy. Anyway, I digress. We come into the church to be saved, that we may live in peace and sit down in the kingdom of heaven. If we listen to and circulate every evil report, we shall idly spend the time which we should be appropriated to the reading of the Scriptures, the Book of Mormon. We must remember the words of Alma, pray much at morning, noon, and night, feed the poor, etc. You got to love how quickly Eliza Snow must have been writing these things to catch how much of what Lucy Mack Smith was saying here. It's quite remarkable. She said she was old, could not meet with the society but few more times, and wished to leave her testimony that the Book of Mormon is the book of God, that Joseph is a man of God, a prophet of the Lord set apart to lead the people, and he's just the nicest boy any of you lovely women are ever going to meet. If we observe his words, it will be well with us. If we live righteously on earth, it will be well with us in eternity. End quote. So the thing is Lucy had it rough as a widow, right? And at least she always had a family who were there for her, who cared for her. And she recounts a story from back in 1841 about injuring her knee, but then being attended to by her daughters, Sophronia and Lucy. And I guess this would be technically Lucy Jr. Lucy Smith Jr., and then Sophronia Smith. Quote, in the winter, I went to Bear Creek on a visit to Brother Sidney A. Knowlton's. When I arrived, there was a dark, and I was very cold, and in getting out of the wagon, stepped upon some round substance, which rolling under my foot brought my round so suddenly that in trying to save myself from falling, I injured my right knee. The cold settled in the injured part, and the rheumatism set in. I suffered considerably while there, but I only remained about 1 week, and after I returned, my lameness increased. This, with other sickness produced by the same cause, kept me very low all winter, and for 6 weeks I had watchers every night. Sophronia Smith McCleary and Lucy Smith Milliken took care of me, and faithfully did they watch over me. Never was a disconsolate widow more blessed in her children than I was in them. End quote. Of course, you'll find a link to her reminiscence or her memoir in the show notes. But even though Lucy was oftentimes holed up in bed with sickness and with arthritis during Nauvoo, she still saw a lot of things that transpired. She recounts, quote, some assassins attempt to shoot Lilburn Boggs, governor of Missouri. In a thrice the cry went forth that Joe Smith had shot Gov. Boggs, end quote. But she tells in her memoirs that Joe was preaching, quote, to some 4,000 or 5,000 persons the day previous and was at a public training the same day, end quote. So obviously her little angel never would have shot that rotten old Governor Boggs. And she goes on to tell her side of Joe getting arrested in Dixon, Illinois by Sheriffs Wilson and Reynolds in July of 1843. Quote, they remained until the next summer and then made the intended visit to Dixon. But while Joseph was there, the Missourians, being apprised of his absence from Nauvoo, sent Sheriff Reynolds to Governor Ford, who gave him a writ, with which he pursued Joseph to Dixon and took him prisoner, but did not read the writ, but abused Joseph shamefully. Their proceedings being unlawful, Joseph took them in turn when he came to a place where he could do so, and he was cleared. End quote. And Lucy discusses the time following this arrest as kind of like a brief era of good feelings about Nauvoo, at least from her vantage point. Quote, "There was now a season of peace which lasted until the winter of 1844, when the police of the city was organized. Joseph, in addressing them, said that if there was not such men as Brutus in the church, he might live as long as Caesar would have lived. One of the brethren, suspecting that Joseph had allusion to William Law, mentioned it to an intimate friend. This friend was a very imaginative turn of mind, and his suspicions being roused, he went to William Law and told a tremendous tale which Law believed. When he asked Joseph about it, a council was called, and Joseph proved what he did say. This satisfied Law that he said that he believed that no harm was intended to him or any other person." End quote. And then after that, in her memoir, Lucy goes on to tell about a scoundrel of a man who joined the movement in Nauvoo, Joseph H. Jackson. Ooh, there's that scary anti-Mormon name again. And she includes accusations against Jackson that aren't really present basically anywhere else, but her allegations sure are interesting. Now, listeners to the Patreon exclusive feed of the show, you get to hear an audiobook version of Jackson's expose with my commentary. Patreon.com/nakedmormonism. If you want to support the show, it'd be super appreciated. A whole bunch of extra content. Anyway, here's what Lucy says about Joseph H. Jackson. Quote, "About this time, a man by the name of Joseph Jackson, who had been several months in the place, asked Hiram for his daughter Lavina, for he wished to make a wife of her. Hiram, not choosing to have his daughter marry a man who did not belong to the church, refused, for this and other reasons, to give her to him. This Jackson then asked Joseph, to his influence with Hiram, to get the girl for him. Joseph refusing to do so, Jackson went to William Law to get his assistance in stealing Lavina from her father. Hiram heard of this and came to me several times for advice. He said he was alarmed about her, that he felt worse than he did when he was in prison. Jackson went from one to another wherever he could learn that anyone had any feeling against our family. He held secret meetings till finally he succeeded in getting a number to join in a conspiracy to murder the whole Smith family." End quote. And Jackson's role in Nauvoo is one full of adventure and disinformation, making the truth pretty hard to tease out. Now, Jackson himself claimed that he refused to be married to anybody in Nauvoo, as it would frustrate his plans of espionage of the criminal empire, even though, according to Jackson, Joe took Jackson all around the various brothels in Nauvoo and offered plenty of women to Jackson to marry if he just joined the church. But here we also have Lucy claiming that the troubles with Jackson started because Jackson wanted to marry Hiram's daughter, Lavina, and planned to kidnap Lavina, which seems frankly believable considering who Joseph Jackson was. But then Lucy pins this disagreement about Lavina as the cause for the whole trouble with Jackson and the printers of the Nauvoo Expositor, which is kind of putting the cart before the horse and missing out on the conflict between the Expositor printers and Jackson and the Nauvoo leadership to begin with. But Lucy's version of the growing conflict with the Expositor publishers and Jackson against her sons shows how much Joseph and Hiram were able to keep all of these things secret and hide the drama and chaos of polygamy and theocracy building from not only the standard Mormon public, but even from their own mom, who lived in Joseph's house and was best friends with Emma, who knew a lot about what was going on in Nauvoo. Now, if they could keep polygamy and everything that was going on under wraps from their own mom while she was living in the house with Joe, they could obviously keep it hidden from the larger Mormon public, not only for a time, though, which is why the Expositor was such a bombshell when it was published. Lucy also talks about Charles Foster pointing a pistol at Joseph Smith in broad daylight with the whole Augustine and Orson Spencer conflict. She says, quote, "Joseph caught his hand and prevented him and was compelled to hold Foster in this way above an hour in order to preserve his own life," end quote. So when Foster pulled that pistol and pointed it on Joseph Smith, Lucy says that Joe caught his hands and then had to pin him down for an hour. But another account says that it was pistol-packing Porter Rockwell who knocked the gun out of Charles Foster's hands, while yet another account, the official in the history of the church, says it was Robert Foster who told his younger brother to put away the piece. Whatever, but I should also note that Joe having to hold down Charles Foster for an hour to preserve his life, that is simply impossible. It was maybe for a few minutes, if it even did happen, if Joe even had to hold him down. And I can assure you that Charles could breathe the entire time because he didn't die while he was, crying out for his mom or something. Lucy does, however, talk about the Nauvoo Expositor. Quote, "The apostates, with Jackson at their head, continued to gather strength until finally they established a printing press in our midst. Through this organ, they belched forth the most intolerable and the blackest of lies that was ever palmed upon a community." End quote. And she remembers the sequence of events more vaguely than the historical record actually reveals. And she was recounting these events months after they happened, while she was racked with grief, having just lost 3 of her sons, Hiram, Joseph, and Samuel, who died a month after the Carthage shootout when Hiram and Joseph died. Now, the last pages of Lucy's dictated memoir read as follows, quote, "My sons, knowing that the men by whom the governor was surrounded were sworn to take their lives at first, fled to Iowa. But the pledged faith of the state for their protection, and Hiram was inclined to come back, as he heard the governor had threatened to burn the city if the prisoners were not given up. Many of the brethren thought they ought to give themselves up for the trial. But Joseph, if he went, he should die. However, he was willing to die for thee." And then there are pages missing. There are pages missing. The next written line in her memoir from, Martha Corey, who was, writing as Lucy dictated, it says, quote, "I have now given my history of my life as far as I intend carrying it at this time." End quote. It ends mid-sentence because there are pages missing. The final days are missing from Lucy Mack Smith's record. And it sucks. It sucks. She does add in the next session, quote, "All that I have written is true and will stand forever. Yes, it will stand before God at that hour when it shall be, and great shall appear to answer at his bar for the deeds done in the body, whether they be good or evil. Then and there will I meet the persecutors of my family, who are the enemies of the church, and declare with a voice that shall penetrate the ears of every intelligence, which shall be present on that momentous occasion." End quote. For Lucy, a mother who had just lost 3 sons, she had survived her husband and all but one of her sons. And that one son who did survive, William, he was the black sheep of the family. Anyway, the only solace that Lucy Mack Smith took was in her ability to testify at the bar of judgment after death against the people who persecuted her family and the church that her sons started. Lucy would live another 11 years after this memoir was completed, sickly, grieving, and cared for by her daughters and her daughter-in-law, Emma, until her death in Nauvoo in 1856. When the Nauvoo Expositor was published, the authors of it were intentionally vague. Because of sexual slander laws, which unfortunately, as a byproduct of those laws, protected men from public exposure for adultery or sexual assault, names of people involved in polygamy were almost always obscured or redacted from exposés, even those which were most critical of the church. The authors of these exposés feared legal repercussions, and they insulated themselves from lawsuits and slander by referring only obliquely to details which may reveal who was at issue within the given exposé, but only sort of kind of mentioning those details in passing, and very rarely ever actually putting a name to the people they talk about. Now, the Nauvoo Expositor accomplished these oblique references by revealing only marginal details of those who were caught up in polygamy. But a few passages from the Expositor bear discussion because of the subject we're talking about here. Speaking of how Joe and other practitioners of polygamy would mark and acquire their prey, the Expositor reveals some troubling aspects of Joe's methodology here. And what we're about to read, this is disgusting. This is ecclesiastical abuse for sexual gratification of the Mormon elite. This may be uncomfortable for some to hear. And it's also a long passage which centers around the lived experience of two teenage girls that we're going to discuss in a minute. So please bear with me for this reading. Quote, "They are also notified that Brother Joseph will see them soon and reveal the mysteries of heaven to their full understanding, which seldom fails to inspire them with new confidence in the prophet, as well as great anxiety to know what God has laid up in store for them in return for the great sacrifice of father and mother, gold and silver, which they gladly left far behind, that they might be gathered into the fold and numbered among the chosen of God." That right there is the first big clue to who William Law is writing about in this, and we're going to talk about him in a minute. They are visited again, and what is the result? They are requested to meet Brother Joseph or some of the 12 at some insulated point or at some particularly described place on the bank of the Mississippi or at some room which wears upon its front positively no admittance. The harmless, inoffensive, and unsuspecting creatures are so devoted to the prophet and the cause of Jesus Christ that they do not dream of a deep-laid and fatal scheme which prostrates happiness and renders death itself desirable. But they meet him, expecting to receive through him a blessing and learn the will of the Lord concerning them. And what awaits the faithful follower of Joseph, the apostle and prophet of God, when in the stead thereof they are told, after having been sworn in one of the most solemn manners to never divulge what is revealed to them with a penalty of death attached, that God Almighty has revealed it to him that she should be his, Joseph's, spiritual wife. For it was right anciently, and God will tolerate it again. But we must keep those pleasures and blessings from the world, for until there is a change in the government, we will endanger ourselves by practicing it. But we can enjoy the blessings of Jacob, David, and others, as well as be deprived of them if we do not expose ourselves to the law of the land. She is thunderstruck, faints, recovers, and refuses. The prophet damns her if she rejects. She thinks of the great sacrifice and of the many thousands miles she has traveled over sea and land that she might save her soul from pending ruin, and replies, "God's will be done, and not mine." The prophet and his devotees in this way are gratified. The next step to avoid public exposition from the common course of things, they are sent away for a time until all is well, after which they return as from a long visit. Those whom no power or influence could seduce, except that which is wielded by some individual feigning to be a god, must realize the remarks of an able writer when he says, "If woman's feelings are turned to ministers of sorrow, where shall she look for consolation? Her lot is to be wooed and won. Her heart is like some fortress that has been captured, sacked, abandoned, and left desolate. With her, the desire of the heart has failed. The great charm of existence is at its end. She neglects all the cheerful exercises of life, which gladden the spirits, quicken the pulses, and send the tide of life in healthful currents through the veins. Her rest is broken. The sweet refreshment of sleep is poisoned by melancholy dreams. Dry sorrow drinks her blood until her enfeebled frame sinks under the slightest external injury. Look for her after a little while, and you find friendship weeping over her untimely grave, and wondering that one who but so recently glowed with all the radiance and health and beauty should so speedily be brought down to darkness and despair. You will be told of some wintry chill, of some casual indisposition that laid her low, but no one knows of the mental malady that previously sapped her strength and made her so easy a prey to the spoiler. She is like some tender tree, the pride and beauty of the grove, graceful in its form, bright in its foliage, but with the worm preying at its heart. We find it withered when it should be most luxuriant. We see it drooping its branches to the earth and shedding leaf by leaf until wasted and perished away. It falls in the stillness of the forest, and as we muse over the beautiful ruin, we strive in vain to recollect the blast or thunderbolt that could have smitten it with decay. But no one knows the cause, except the foul fiend who perpetrated the diabolical deed. Our hearts have mourned and bled at the wretched and miserable condition of females in this place. Many orphans," there's another clue, "many orphans have been the victims of misery and wretchedness through the influence that has been exerted over them under the cloak of religion. And afterwards, in consequence of that jealous disposition which predominates over the minds of some, have been turned upon a wide world, fatherless and motherless, destitute of friends and fortune, and robbed of that which nothing but death can restore. Men solace themselves by saying, 'The facts slumber in the dark caverns of midnight, but lo, it is sudden day, and the dark deeds of foul fiends shall be exposed from the housetops.' It is difficult, perhaps impossible, to describe the wretchedness of females in this place without wounding the feelings of the benevolent or shocking the delicacy of the refined. But the truth shall come to the world. The remedy can never be applied unless the disease is known. The sympathy, ever anxious to relieve, cannot be felt before the misery is seen." End quote. William Law, in the Nauvoo Expositor, in that passage we just read, is describing a pattern of sexual predation which can never go unnoticed when studying Nauvoo and broader religious polygamy history. Law successfully concealed the identity of the victims for the readers of the time, although some would have known who he was talking about, but for historians now we know exactly who Law was pointing to. The Lawrence sisters, Sarah and Maria. Sarah and Maria Lawrence were friends of William and Jane Law when they converted to the church in Canada. The Law family led the immigration to Commerce, Illinois in mid-1839 while the Mormons were settling the area as refugees from Missouri. Sarah and Maria Lawrence were orphans who the Laws essentially adopted at this time, but never officially. They were basically godparents of the Lawrence sisters until they all arrived in Commerce, soon to become Nauvoo. Eventually, Emma and Joe became the wards of the Lawrence sisters, who moved into the Nauvoo homestead and later the Nauvoo mansion, living together as a sealed family. However, the Lawrence sisters also had a large inheritance they couldn't access until they were legal adults. Sarah and Maria were first marked by Joseph Smith when he and Hingepin Sidney Rigdon visited the Ontario branch of the church in August 1837. Maria was 13 years old. Sarah was 11 years old at that time. So the Lawrence sisters traveled with the Laws to Illinois in the wake of the Missouri Mormon War, and their father, Edward, died probably in March of 1840, leaving Maria and Sarah, aged 17 and 14, without a legal guardian because their mother, Margaret, had yet to remarry, and single women couldn't have legal custody of their children at the time. When Emma and Joe became Maria and Sarah's guardians, they were put in control as trustees of the Lawrence estate. As Todd Compton writes in his book In Sacred Loneliness, quote, "This guardian relationship is not fully understood," end quote, which is quite an understatement as it became a major source of dispute between Joe and the Lawrence sisters' mother, Margaret, after she remarried. He continues in Sacred Loneliness, quote, "After Josiah Butterfield married Margaret, he began consulting with Joseph Smith concerning the Lawrence inheritance. Presumably, the estate could now be transferred to Margaret and Josiah, who would act as Maria and Sarah's guardians. But for unknown reasons, this did not happen. Tensions began to simmer between Joseph and Josiah Butterfield concerning the estate, until on March 28, 1843, it erupted into violence. Quote, Josiah Butterfield came to my house and insulted me so outrageously that I kicked him out of the house, across the yard, and into the street." End quote. What that insult is, we don't actually know, but I think we can infer. What an insult to accuse the money-hungry prophet of stealing the estate of two orphan teenagers who he had married earlier that year at ages 19 and 17. The dispute over this inheritance, the Lawrence inheritance, wouldn't be resolved before Joseph Smith died. Now, there are other passages in Joe's journal for the remainder of 1843 and in a January 44 of him dealing with the Lawrence estate, which was apparently valued somewhere at $3,790 in November of 1843. On January 23rd, 44, quote, Joseph sent for William Clayton to assist in settling with brother John Taylor about the Lawrence estate, end quote, which Todd Compton summarizes by saying, quote, There is some evidence that Smith intended to transfer the guardianship to John Taylor, but there is no certain evidence that this ever took place, end quote. Not to Margaret Lawrence and Josiah Butterfield, but to John Taylor, Joe's boy, instead of the guy who Joe kicked out of his house because he felt so insulted by what Josiah Butterfield had said. So what that all means, in all likelihood, is that Joe stole the estate of 2 orphan teenage girls, then he raped them under the guise of the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. That estate was to the tune of nearly $4,000. Now, William and Jane Law cared for the Lawrence sisters. They were family friends in Canada before immigrating to Nauvoo, and that passage that we just read from the Nauvoo Expositor, it's written about them. And it perfectly describes PTSD. So when the final straw broke for Emma and she removed all of her sister wives from the Nauvoo mansion, arrangements were made for Maria and Sarah Lawrence, and they moved somewhere else in town. The location is unknown because there's not a whole lot of documentation about them, but it could have been back in with their remarried mother or possibly somewhere else. The record just isn't clear. What precipitated their removal from the home is quite remarkable. Picking up in Todd Compton's book, page 476, quote, "The marriage to the Lawrence sisters became public knowledge when William Law, Joseph's second counselor in the first presidency, became alienated from the prophet. Law, who had known the Lawrence family since their conversion in Canada, chose the marriage of Smith to Maria Lawrence as a test case with which to prosecute Smith for adultery. On May 23rd, he filed suit against the Mormon leader in Hancock County Circuit Court at Carthage, charging that Smith had been living with Maria Lawrence in an open state of adultery from October 12, 1843 to the day of the suit. In response, Smith flatly denied polygamy in a speech delivered on May 26th. What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives when I can only find one. Now that thing that Joe just said, I can only find one, that was said during the same exact speech that Joe made when he said that he has more to boast of than Jesus. Continuing on in Todd Compton's book. Smith and his counselors evidently decided to counterattack, prosecuting Law for slandering Maria Lawrence. On June 4th, the Mormon Leader's Journal reads, "In council with Taylor, Babbitt, Hiram, Richards, Woodworth, and Phelps, etc., about prosecution of the Laws and Fosters in behalf of Maria Lawrence for slander. Concluded to go to Quincy with Taylor and give up my bonds of guardianship of Maria Lawrence, etc." The phrase, "give up my bonds of guardianship," suggests that Smith was transferring the guardianship to Taylor, but curiously, there is a certificate dated June 4th, 1844, notarized by a Quincy Justice of the Peace, marking Joseph guardian of the Lawrences, end quote. So whether these Lawrence sisters wanted or not, they became one of the primary focuses of the Nauvoo Expositor and the legal fight between William Law and Joseph Smith. Notably as well, in the Expositor passage that we read, Joe told these sisters that that their little relationship that he was cooking up between them would need to remain secret until there was a change in government. Joseph Smith wanted his Zionic revolution to instate a Mormon polygynous government over America once the established constitution was replaced with what his Council of 50 had drafted as their constitution. These sisters, at ages 20 and 18, became secret widows when their abuser was assassinated in Carthage. Sarah was sealed to bloody Brigham Young, and Maria was sealed to Almond Babbitt. Maria died in 1847, 3 years after Carthage, of unknown causes at age 23. As Compton reports in Sacred Loneliness, a letter to the Deseret News from Benjamin F. Johnson describes Maria's condition from 1844 to 47. Quote, "Maria Lawrence died of consumption, or one might more truthfully put it, of a broken heart. My Aunt Lucy visited her and felt great sympathy for her. She said to Aunt one time that if there was any truth in Mormonism, she would be saved. For, said she, my yoke has not been easy, nor my burden light." As to what was the cause of Maria's deep sorrow, I do not exactly know. She suffered her doubts, her fears, her uncertainty as to whether she was acting right or wrong, for she had a conscience and wanted to be right. All these things told on a sensitive nature." End quote. So Maria died 3 years after her secret husband and sexual abuser was killed in Carthage at age 23 of unknown causes. It says of consumption or of a broken heart. They didn't have the terminology to understand anxiety, depression, PTSD in the 1840s. So Sarah went to Utah. Maria's younger sister, Sarah Lawrence, went to Utah at age 21, sealed to Brigham Young. She later fled Utah to Napa Valley, California, and she established a farm for herself and her children. And Sarah later visited Utah in the 1860s and viciously attacked the doctrine of polygamy and the damage it caused to practitioners. She saw it kill her older sister. I mean, of course she did. Sarah also denied any connection that she had with Joseph in Nauvoo, and then she died of quote-unquote cancer womb at age 46, which possibly could be a complication of an STI she acquired in Nauvoo or Utah as yet another unspoken reality of polygamy. So I chose to end today's episode with this turn towards the melancholy in Sarah and Maria Lawrence's stories, because it's often a side of history lost when we have the privilege of viewing these matters with hindsight and disconnected from the human element. But that's a mistake. Maria clearly suffered from some horrible mental illness as a result of what happened to her in Nauvoo, and she died probably from depression, although the record is very unclear. Sarah suffered the consequences in a different way and lived for decades longer to tell her tale, only to be viciously attacked by the women in Utah when she visited there, women who she considered her friends and sister wives for years before she fled to California. These young girls, these Lawrence sisters, were marked at ages 13 and 11 by the prophet, just like Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner, just like Fanny Alger, just like Helen Mar Kimball, and just like every other child victim of polygamy. Their stories are too often forgotten or simply overshadowed by other events that we view as more consequential or more controversial, but to ignore them and to ignore their stories and experiences is to ignore the darker side of history and religious power dynamics that are, if we ignore these, it's a disservice to their struggles to forget them. Now, we are very near the beginning of our Road to Carthage series, and we'll be examining many different angles of Joseph Smith's life. Now, I've received a number of messages from people who can't wait for us to finally put Joey in the ground. I'm with you, each and every one of you. Look, I have taken absolutely every step to vilify and destroy any whitewashed and rose-scented legacy this man may have left behind on this podcast. I make no effort at concealing my biases and disgust for Joseph Smith and who he was, and the church which followed in his wake. And I want us all to understand those biases and the privilege that we have to view Joseph Smith and his story through a historical lens. Now, whether it's Eliza R. Snow, the Apostles or the Council of 50, Brigham Young, Lucy Mack Smith, Joseph H. Jackson, Sarah and Maria Lawrence, Emma, William and Jane Law, Governor Ford or Thomas Sharp of the Warsaw Signal, Helen Mar Kimball and her parents, Heber and Villot, Sidney and Phoebe Rigdon and their daughter Nancy, John C. Bennett, Emily and Eliza Partridge, Elizabeth Davis Durfee or Patty Sessions, Alva and Louisa Beeman, David and John Whitmer, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, Sophronia Smith. It doesn't matter who it is. Each and every one of these people were affected in some way by what transpired the evening of June 27th, 1844. Each of their lives were moved and shaped by one human being in one way or another. This one person. Each and every one of these people were overcome with complicated emotions when they first heard of the death of Joseph Smith. And I'd like to think that they remember the moment when they heard it. Like we remember when we first learned about JFK getting shot, or like the Twin Towers, or some monumental thing happening. Each and every one of these people likely remembered the exact moment when they heard that the prophet had been slain. Each and every one of them had their lives forever changed that day. Each and every one of them were overcome by emotions that we could never understand. We can only see a window into their minds by the stories they left behind. That's going to do it for our episode today. We have a couple of pledge increases on patreon.com/Naked Mormonism. We have a pledge increase from Devin, a pledge increase from Darren, fantastic name. And then we also have a brand new pledge, and that comes from Rod. So 3 new patrons. Thank you all so much for pledging to support the show at patreon.com/Naked Mormonism. So if you also got in a one-time donation on PayPal, if you want to do that, it's just BryceBlankenagel@gmail.com for anyone who wants to do a one-time donation. But this one-time donation was an extremely generous from Randall Brower. So to Randall and for everybody who supports the show and sends in those one-time donations, it means a lot. Thank you so much, Randall. So if you want to join the ranks of these wonderful, fine, fantastic people, you can do that. Patreon.com/Naked Mormonism. You get a whole bunch of extra content. You get extended editions of the last 100 episodes plus 100 plus episodes. You get transcripts of the last 100 plus episodes. You get an extra episode every Monday, except for the Road to Carthage series. We're not doing extra patron episodes on there. And yeah, it's just a whole bunch of extra content. You get the patron exclusive message boards, all kinds of cool stuff. And hey, you also get a shout out on the show, and you know that your money is going to funding research to try and bring to light the real history of the real Mormon Church in an accessible and hopefully entertaining format. So if that sounds awesome, if that sounds like a whole lot of fun, sign up. Support the show, patreon.com/Naked Mormonism. I also wanted to get to a little bit of listener mail. And so the first listener mail, this actually comes from somebody who I call the general authority of the Glassbox podcast. This comes in from Shannon Grover. She has been with the Glassbox podcast since basically the very beginning. She's been a longtime supporter of that show. Shannon listened to the last episode, and this is her comment. I'm just going to read it verbatim. There's a little explicit word in here, but hopefully you can bear with me. Shannon says, Emma, Eliza, and the stairs. The real question is, why didn't anyone shove Joseph down the fucking stairs? But anyway, that shows the extreme misogyny of the time and of when these researchers were doing their presentations. Why did they all blame Eliza? And Shannon, that is, God, isn't that just the point? Isn't that the largest point of all when it comes to anything that we talk about in Mormon history? Why is Joseph never blamed? Why is he never seen as the problem? Why is it called persecution instead of him running a criminal empire? Why? And that's because he is the infallible prophet to millions of people and has been for their entire lives. Fantastic question. Fantastic email. Thank you so much, Shannon. Also, got in a correction from 2 weeks ago, actually. I got this in last week. I just neglected to read it on the show. My mistake. Anyway, so this correction came in from Dustin. And Dustin revealed a problem. What happens when I just go off script and talk off the cuff? Dustin says, thank you for your amazing podcast. I just want to send in a correction. It's in episode 211. It's about Uncle John Smith. And if y'all remember the story, John Smith came and visited Joe and Hiram and all the dudes in Carthage Jail, and the jailer didn't want to let John Smith up there. When I told that story, I went off script and said, and John Smith is the father of Joseph F. Smith and Joseph Fielding Smith, two prophets of the church. No, I was talking off the cuff, and I didn't, I just didn't think about it, and I just said that stuff. So Dustin says, you said that his son was Joseph F. Smith, his grandson was Joseph Fielding Smith. Those are Hiram's sons. I don't know what was in my mind or why I said that, and that's why I try and stay on script as much as possible, because I double and triple check everything that actually goes into the script, with only a few exceptions. So it was actually George Albert Smith, who was the son of John Smith, and George A. Smith, who was the guy who came in near the end of the History of the Church project that became the 7-volume set that we have today. That History of the Church project, that's George A. Smith. That's John Smith's son. George Albert Smith was George A. Smith's son. George Albert Smith was the George who was the prophet of the church. And George A. Smith is the guy who's known as the saint. They call him Saint George, because he planted potatoes when he made his way across the plains into Utah. So, Dustin, thank you so much for the correction. I always appreciate corrections like this. I occasionally say stuff off the cuff, or I occasionally don't verify something right before I say it, and I occasionally digress off script and make mistakes. And I appreciate you and everybody else who sends in corrections, keeping me honest and keeping me up to speed. So with that, we are all done for the episode today. Hey, so I know I talk about patreon.com/Naked Mormonism a lot, and hey, that's my paycheck. So of course it's all part of the show, and I don't do ads. We've done ads in the past before, but I don't like to do them. I think they're cheesy, and if you're selling a product that you don't actually make, or you don't actually believe in, I'm not a big fan of it. Anyway, so if you want to support the show, seriously, it helps out a ton. If this is a product that you enjoy, it's my paycheck, and it really means a lot. Otherwise, hey, a way that you can help out the show is by spreading the word, sharing it. If there's a single episode that you enjoy, share it. Joe Geisner, who's the editor of Writing Mormon History, he just recently shared the episode last week's about Emma and Val Avery and Linda Newell. Because he was the editor of the book, and he apparently really enjoyed it. And a lot of people have said that they enjoyed that. So that right there, that's the best way to spread the word about the show. It helps a ton. Or, hey, iTunes reviews, or, whatever podcasting app you use, that helps a ton in the rankings and visibility when people are looking for Mormon history podcasts. If you want to help spread the word, seriously, it means a lot. And it doesn't cost you any money. It just costs you some time, which really is your most valuable resource. And with that, I want to say thank you for giving me your most valuable resource, and as I like to say, for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the Law Offices of P. Andrew Torres and the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved.